Oh, hey.
Hey,
Hello.
Merry Christmas.
Merry Christmas to you,
It's
Rick.
a Christmas Eve
Is it
and all
now?
over the world.
Are you following Santa Cam?
People, yes, I've just been all day. I've been following where Santa is coming next, if he's coming here, when he's coming.
Yeah.
Calling Chris Anderson, North Pole, where are you?
No, I'm actually in London, but Madeline is home from the University of Toronto, so I've been kicked out of the studio and I'm
Oh,
upstairs. So
you're in the vast office space
yes,
of History
yes.
Happy Hour.
And you look
Uh,
like you're still in
I,
Chicago,
I am here in the studio in Chicago.
celebrating Christmas in Chicago.
Celebrating Christmas. Welcome everybody to History Happy Hour, brought to you with the help of Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours, offering a variety of history tours in Europe, the U.S., and the Pacific. And by the way, Chris and I both just got back from trips, and so
Yeah.
Chris, on
What?
December 16th,
Look at that. Or around the world. History happy
you were
hour around the world.
celebrating the 80th anniversary of the 79th anniversary of the Battle
Yeah.
of the Bulge
Not get ahead
in
of ourselves.
Bastogne, and I was celebrating the 250th anniversary of the Boston Tea Party on the same day. I don't suppose anybody on the day of the Battle of the Bulge in Europe remembered that that was
Remember
the
that.
Boston Tea Party. They're like, damn it,
Uh,
they attacked on the
They
Tea
missed
Party
it. Yeah,
day.
right. That's right. And I was supposed to be at the reenactment, and damn it, I'm here. But you never know. You never know. You know.
Whether you're watching live, watching on replay, or listening on the HHH podcast. Thank you for joining us today. We are in an encore episode about Pointe-du-Hoc. Let us know you're out there and what you're drinking. And Chris, look, I have the top shelf patrons, and look at this. It's
It's
evened off.
look at how'd that happen? Did you like mess
We
with the?
added two people,
You
Jeannie
did.
Bow and Chuck Court. And Chuck Court, who 30 seconds after he signed on as a top shelf patron said, "How do I get my hat?"
Yeah, I saw that email.
So,
I understand.
oh, and the
Uh,
phone's ringing, so I will get that later.
should we
Okay,
just start
I
doing
don't know,
this one?
somebody who doesn't know that we do History Happy Hour, the phone's ringing, somebody's coming in the door. It's crazy times here.
That's not like Santa's thing. I bet your Amazon packages.
I don't know.
Uh,
Anyway, thanks to everybody who supports us on Patreon. And I mean, if you're out there, let us know what you're drinking. Let us know how you're celebrating Christmas. And meantime, Chris, why don't we get this show underway?
all right.
Okay.
The bar is open.
The bar is open. And Chris, what is on tap today?
Yeah, well, this week our guest is something of a legend amongst military history people. Stephen Zaloga is the author of several hundred of the Osprey titles. So if you're a military historian or anybody with an interest in World War II, chances are you have some of his books on your shelves. They're kind of hard to avoid. And they're all
Osprey,
very good.
Vanguard, and others,
And
yes.
others, yes. But he, to get through the bio stuff, he is an analyst in the aerospace industry with over 3 decades and has served with the Institute for Defense Analysis when he's not writing all the books that allow Osprey to keep publishing all their books. But again, many Osprey titles that many people refer to all the time. And he has also written books like The Devil's Garden about German defenses in Normandy, which is one of my favorites. And the book we're going to be talking about this week is one of his recent ones, Smashing Hitler's Guns, The Rangers at Pointe-du-Hoc, D-Day 1944. So, Steve, welcome.
Welcome to History Happy Hour.
How you doing?
Good.
We're doing good. We're doing good. Chris, get us started.
All right. Well, I mean, kind of the obvious one when we first saw the book. I knew it would be good, but I thought to myself, Pointe-du-Hoc, you've picked a topic that is clearly kind of one of those iconic moments of World War II history. Lots of people have written about it, and
Including you before.
what made you decide? There's something that's missing here, and there's a new look, a new take. What drew you to it?
The reason that I did this particular book is that I had actually done an earlier book for Osprey. They have a series called Raids about famous raids, and I did one on Pointe-du-Hoc and the Rangers for them some years ago, almost a decade ago. Now, the problem is that those Osprey books are quite small. They're roughly 20,000 words. And so as I researched it, I realized that the subject is a lot bigger than could be fit into that kind of a format, and particularly the issues that surround the raid itself. The raid itself, Rutter's companies of Rangers who go against the batteries at Pointe-du-Hoc, that part of the story is well known, but a lot of the other aspects of it are not very well known. You know, why did the Germans have the battery there? Why weren't the guns at the battery on D-Day? What was the story behind the air campaign before the Rangers got there? What was the story about the naval campaign? What about the other elements of the Rangers who landed at Omaha Beach on D-Day? So there's a lot of issues floating around the Rangers and Pointe-du-Hoc that have not been covered or not been covered in depth. And during my earlier work, I stumbled into quite a few new historical sources on these issues. So I thought it justified another look at the subject.
And we're going to dive into this topic, but before we do, Steve, I wanted to ask you. So I read it in the material that I was looking at that, if I have this right, that both your grandfather and your father were on Omaha Beach or on the D-Day beaches on D-Day. So, and that is kind of the inspiration for your interest in World War II writing. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
My grandfather was on Omaha Beach on D-Day. My dad wasn't. He was on Omaha Beach. My dad arrived on Omaha Beach a little bit over a week later.
Okay.
My grandfather was in an engineer port company, which is a type of engineer unit, U.S. Army engineer unit that's intended to facilitate the logistics. So he landed on D-Day. My dad was also happened to be in an engineer battalion, but not in that type of battalion. He was in a special services engineer battalion, which is basically a heavy construction unit. And he landed on Omaha Beach a little bit over a week after. His battalion was responsible for a lot of the construction and cleanup work because, as you know, Omaha Beach, I mean, aside from the famous landing and the capture of Omaha Beach, it was a major logistics center for the U.S. Army during the Normandy campaign. That's where a lot of the U.S. supplies came through. And, you know, for example, there was plans to establish Mulberry Harbor there. So there was the need for a lot of construction work there. My dad's battalion was involved in that.
Okay. So
bottom line is those that I've been hearing D-Day stories since I was a kid.
yeah.
What got me interested in Normandy was, you know, the fact that, you know, my dad's generation took part in that. And strangely enough, on my mom's side, my mom's French Canadian, but her family comes from that area. So there's another connection, except that the family left that area more than 300 years ago. So
they got when the getting was good.
Yeah, not quite as immediate a connection as my dad and grandfather.
So, Steve, obviously, I think people think they know a lot about the Rangers, and I think they know a lot about the force that was deployed there. But maybe just to kind of set a baseline for us, can you tell us a little bit about the Ranger units involved and sort of their makeup, and if there's anything that we've missed about them? Before we get into
They were established in response to a request from the headquarters of the U.S. Army in the European theater. Now, there were obviously earlier Ranger battalions. The two that landed on Normandy were the 2nd and the 5th. The other three were formed for the Mediterranean theater, the best known of which is Darby's Rangers, the 1st Rangers, who landed during Operation Torch in North Africa. So they're sort of the lead Ranger battalion in the war in the Atlantic theater. And Darby's Rangers landed both at North Africa, then again at Sicily, and then for a third time during the Italian campaign at Anzio. So they established this this precedent of using a specialized force patterned on the British commandos to spearhead amphibious operations, Torch, Husky for Sicily, and later Anzio. So when Normandy was being planned in 1942-43, the U.S. Army in the European theater said, well, we're going to need some Ranger units. And so the Army decided to establish 2 battalions. There was actually a 3rd battalion that was established, but it didn't stay in existence. And that was the 29th Provisional Ranger Battalion that was formed within the ranks of the 29th Division. Now, that division will ring a bell to anyone interested in Omaha Beach because they're the division that lands over in the Vierville Draw. The 116th Regiment that lands the Vierville Draw on Omaha Beach is from 29th Division. And actually, the Rangers are subordinate to 29th or to the 116th on D-Day. So there is a connection there. But the reason that that battalion didn't survive is that there was controversy about what are the Rangers and what are they supposed to do. Army Ground Forces, which is the element of the U.S. Army that's responsible for combat divisions, both training them and deploying them. The head of the AGF and a large portion of the AGF viewed the Rangers as a means to train U.S. infantry, to train specialized troops in advanced infantry tactics, and then take these young soldiers who had been trained in Ranger tactics and send them back to their units and have them instill these Ranger tactics and values in their infantry battalions. But then other people viewed the Rangers as a spearhead, more like the commandos, highly specialized unit, crack troops, elite troops, given special missions. So there was this controversy right through 1942, 43, 44 about the Rangers. And in the end, it was something of a compromise. But in this process, the 29th Provisional Battalion was disbanded. The troops that had been trained as Rangers went back to their units. So some of these young riflemen who had received Ranger training actually landed on Omaha Beach on D-Day, but within the ranks of the 29th Division, not with the Rangers. So these other two battalions, the 2nd and the 5th battalions, are the units that are scheduled to land at Omaha Beach. And there's debates about what is their mission going to be. The longest standing mission was the matter of taking on the battery at Pointe-du-Hoc, because Pointe-du-Hoc was the longest, most established German coastal artillery battery in that sector. And so right from the outset, Allied planners had said, we've got to deal with that problem, and how do we deal with it? And Rangers had been used to deal with coastal artillery batteries before, namely Darby's Rangers in North Africa. They had specifically been landed to deal with French batteries in North Africa. So, and the commandos had been used repeatedly to attack coastal batteries. For example, the British commandos had been used at Dieppe to attack the batteries on either side of Dieppe. So this idea of using Rangers or commandos to deal with coastal batteries was well established. So pretty quickly, the lead mission for the Rangers on D-Day was established to be deal with Pointe-du-Hoc. And then it became an issue of, well, you've got two battalions. Do you need two battalions to deal with Pointe-du-Hoc? Are there other missions? Would the Rangers be better used elsewhere? And so the plan evolved. And that's one thing that has not been written about before my book came out, is the evolution of the plan. What were the different plans? What did they think of? How do they think about landing the Rangers before the ultimate plan was decided? And then, of course, there were options. What happens at D-Day is that there's a communications foul-up, and so the plan doesn't go as originally planned. The sort of option A is not executed because of communication problems, and they have to go with option B, which is a somewhat different plan than was the original conception.
Steve, let's talk. You've given us some background on the Rangers. Let's talk about the battery a little bit. One of the things, so as I said, I'll be out there in 8 days, and one of the things that people will ask me is, maybe, is why there is so much attention paid to this one battery, because in the end, it is attacked by air, it is attacked by sea, and then they send in the Rangers. So it's quite a show. And there are other batteries. There's Maisie, there's Azeville, there's Crisbeck, there's Long-sur-Mer that don't get nearly that much attention. So what is it about Pointe-du-Hoc that really focuses American and overall Allied attention on it?
I think there's two big issues. One of those being the type of battery that it was, and the second being what it could hit. And as far as the type of battery, there were two types of coastal batteries in Normandy on D-Day. The most common type were just ordinary infantry division artillery batteries. And by that, I mean, this sector was held by the German 716th Infantry Division. Each of their batteries were set up near the coastline and given targets along the coastline. But these are infantry division batteries. They have no specialized anti-ship capability. They don't have command and control bunkers to deal with naval targets. So they're basically intended to bombard the beaches. What Pointe-du-Hoc was a coastal battery intended to perform an anti-ship mission. That is, it had powerful guns that could range out and hit ships, and it had the fire controls that enabled it to do it. So, if you go to Pointe-du-Hoc, you see that command and control bunker right at the very tip where the Ranger Memorial is. Well, that's unique to the type of coastal batteries that are intended to do the anti-ship mission. And then the second reason is, well, what could Pointe-du-Hoc hit? And the big Allied concern was not their warships or anything, it was the transport ships. And especially the transport ships during those critical hour or two prior to the start of the landings, where the transport ships are offloading the troops into the smaller landing craft, into the LCAs and LCVPs. Now, it just so happens that Pointe-du-Hoc was in a position where it could attack both transport areas. It could attack the transport area for Utah Beach, and it could attack the transport area for Omaha Beach. So it's a double threat. It could attack the most vulnerable point in the Allied landing operations as far as the U.S. sectors are concerned, Utah and Omaha. So it was a special target for that reason. Now, strangely, Long-Submerged should have been a similar threat, or viewed as a similar threat by the Allies. And the reason that it's not is that Pointe-du-Hoc was established in 1942. It was a very well-known threat. Long-Submerged was only established in the spring of 1944, and it was never completed. And so it pops up as a threat very, very late in Allied planning, roughly around March, April 1944. And by that date, there's an awful lot of inertia in the Allied planning. So if the Allies had appreciated how sophisticated Long-Submerged actually was, they probably would have done something about it. But it appeared too late for them to include it in the planning the way that Pointe-du-Hoc could be included.
So Steve, one of the things, everybody, I think Pointe-du-Hoc is something that just anybody interested in the topic thinks they know something about. And so the popular conception is we all know about the Rangers going up the cliffs and taking the guns. But as you point out, that's just one of 3 distinct missions that the Ranger Force has on that day. So maybe you could describe what those 3 missions are and how they relate to one another.
Well, the 2 battalions, the Provisional Ranger Group under Earl Rudder was broken into 3 forces. It was called Force A, Force B, Force C. Force A is the main mission against Pointe-du-Hoc, and so that's Rudder and his companies. And that's going to be the critical element of the overall plan. Force B is much smaller. It's a force under Captain Goranson. It's only a couple of companies in strength. They're actually not even of 2 companies, just really 1 company. And that's another attempt to take out another coastal battery. There's a couple of infantry guns on a cliff overlooking Omaha Beach, over to the west of Omaha Beach proper. And Allied planners had seen that and thought, well, these 2 guns can fire enfilade fire down along Omaha Beach. We have to deal with them. So Goranson's Force B was given the task of landing and dealing with those that gun battery that was at Pointe-du-Hoc de la Percée. And then the third force, Force C, is actually kind of the optional force. That's actually the largest of the 3 forces. It's all the 5th Rangers, Max Schneider's 5th Rangers, plus the remaining companies from 2nd Ranger. Now, the idea behind Force C is that if Rudder is successful immediately, meaning within the first half hour or so, then they will send a radio signal to Force C, which is still out to Schneider, and say, okay, it's a go, you follow in behind us. The idea being that Force C would come in and reinforce Force A at Pointe-du-Hoc, and then they would push down and go to their other missions. Their other missions being to attack the MIZ batteries, to attack Grand Camp, and to push down towards Isigny, because one of the main missions on D-Day is not simply to land and take Omaha Beach, it's to capture the ground between Omaha Beach and Utah Beach so that the 2 American beaches can be unified. So part of the broader plan was to help facilitate this linkage between Omaha and Utah, and the Rangers were part of that, if Rudder was able to take Pointe-du-Hoc quickly and easily. Now, option B, and it's actually the option that takes place on D-Day, is that Force C was supposed to land and reinforce the 116th Regimental Combat Team, which is the regimental combat team that's being landed at the Verville Draw, one of the two main draws, one of the two main objectives on Omaha Beach. And they were to land there. If, for example, either rudder fails or nothing happens, they were not to land behind a failed Ranger attempt. Rather, they were to land at Verville and then attack Pointe-du-Hoc by pushing inland and then going to Pointe-du-Hoc by inland routes, not by landing directly at the foot of Pointe-du-Hoc. The assumption is that if the Ranger attack at Pointe-du-Hoc failed, it was probably because the attempt to climb the cliffs or to land at the cliffs had failed. So instead of attacking it that way, Force C was to land at Verville Draw and then push inland along the coast.
So the Rangers are going to be coming in, but they are not the first attack. In fact, they're batting third in this lineup, or fourth, because the first thing that happens is that we send in bombers on Pointe-du-Hoc, and they bomb it, I think, 7 times starting in April and going up until a few days before June 6th. And the very first bombing they do turns out to be very successful, and it results in the Germans moving the actual guns from the casemates. One gun is damaged, the other ones are moved, and they're still moved on June 6th. They're not in position to be firing. So this is a topic that, of course, everybody is interested in and curious about. Did we know that the guns weren't there? Does their lack of presence mean that the mission was unnecessary?
There's several elements to that story. The first part about the air campaign is that, yes, the first attack, there were a couple of squadrons of A-20s that attacked Pointe-du-Hoc in late April, and were very successful. Of the 6 guns stationed there, 1 was destroyed and 2 were damaged. And immediately after that, within a day or so of that air attack, the Germans pulled the guns out and moved them back about 1 kilometer behind Pointe-du-Hoc. It set them up near a tree line not far from Pointe-du-Hoc. And they happened to stay there the whole time, from late April until D-Day. Now, the issue of whether the Allies knew whether the guns had been moved is a source of enormous controversy. There is no record, or I have not found any records that indicate that the Allies knew that the guns had positively been moved. And I have to mention that there's a secondary issue here, and that is that Pointe-du-Hoc, during this period from the April bombing attack to D-Day, there's a lot of activity at Pointe-du-Hoc connected with the reinforcement of the fortifications there. The Germans were in the process of changing all the coastal batteries from being in open gun pits, the type of pits you see at Pointe-du-Hoc, these big circular open gun pits. They were swapping those out for new, heavily reinforced fortifications, bunkers, that would enable the guns to withstand air attack. So when you go to Pointe-du-Hoc, you see 2 different types of gun position, the early initial style of gun pit and then the later style of bunker. Now, what happened as part of that process all along the coast was that the Germans would often move the guns out. So there's a sister battery for Pointe-du-Hoc down at Sword Beach, and they have the same process going on with the bunkers, and they pull their 155 guns out, pull them away from the site in order to get the construction done. And then when the construction is completed, they move the guns back in. So there's some evidence that the Allies knew that the guns had been moved, but the expectation is that the guns are being moved not necessarily because of the damage, they're being moved as part of this fortification effort. Now, on the French side, because the French resistance was keeping an eye on this, the French resistance did inform the Allies that the guns had been moved. The French did have evidence that the guns had been moved back. And there's at least one recollection by a French resistance fighter that said specifically that they had radioed the Allies and said, the Germans had moved the guns back. Now, the problem is what did the Allies know on D-Day or the day before D-Day? Did they think that the guns had been moved back in? And the answer is yes. The Allies thought that the guns had been moved back in. And the reason is that the Allies had persistently sent reconnaissance flights over the Normandy beaches to see all these changes, because at wasn't only Pointe-du-Hoc that was being affected by this construction work. It was all along the beach. So day in and day out, the Allies were sending reconnaissance missions over. And the last mission that they did, which was on the 31st of May, they took pictures of Pointe-du-Hoc, and they saw what they thought were the guns in the gun pits at Pointe-du-Hoc. Now, the problem is that since late 1943, the Germans had put what are sometimes called camouflage umbrellas, which is a large wooden structure with camouflage net. They had erected these over the gun pits. So really all that the Allies really saw was camouflage nets and some little stick or something pointing out, which they assumed was a 155 millimeter gun. So from the Allied perspective, they knew the Germans were moving guns in and out for construction reasons, but they thought that the Pointe-du-Hoc guns had been moved back in. So they were not convinced that the guns were away from the site. And interestingly enough, an Air Force reconnaissance officer who did photo interpretation in the Cold War days, he went back and looked at the contemporary reconnaissance photos and was unable to pick out where the Germans had moved the guns. And part of the issue is that reconnaissance photos back in World War II are not of the quality that people are used to now. The resolution just wasn't that good. So bottom line is the Allied intelligence thinks the guns are there. Now, Rudder had been warned. He had been told that the French had reported the guns had been moved. But once again, he had been fed into the background. The background was, the Germans were moving these guns for construction reasons. So he had to anticipate that the guns were there and he had to deal with them. But he did know that guns had been moved in the past for other reasons.
And of course, if you can move the guns, you can move them back.
That was exactly the issue. And that's why the mission was never canceled. The mission was given the green light for two reasons. Number one, they thought the guns were there. And even if they had a level of uncertainty, they still wanted to deal with the guns. If the guns had been moved back to another firing position, they still could have fired on the transport areas at Utah Beach and Omaha Beach. They didn't have to be in those gun pits on Pointe-du-Hoc in order to fire. They could have fired from where they had been moved. And then secondly, the Rangers had other missions. There was this bigger, broader issue of connecting Utah and Omaha Beach. So it's not as though they'd be wasting the Rangers by sending them there. If they happen to go there, they would probably find the guns, whether it was on Pointe-du-Hoc itself or nearby, they'd probably find them. And then they had other missions. They were to push out from Pointe-du-Hoc as quickly as possible, push south, try to link up so that Omaha and Utah could be linked up.
Steve, actually, one of the things, maybe just add to really quickly, speaking about the French connection that I found fascinating was the fact that the guns at Pointe-du-Hoc were former French pieces, and that the American Army had used that type of cannon during the First World War, so we kind of knew what these guns were capable of doing. I thought that was really fascinating.
Yeah, the vast majority of artillery in the Atlantic Wall, the German fortifications on the coast, were captured guns. The Germans saw no particular reason to waste these vast arsenals of French and Soviet and Italian guns that they had captured. So the majority of guns there were captured types. And so, for example, the 716th Infantry Division, which is the division that's stationed on the D-Day beaches, right from Sword Beach all the way down to Omaha Beach, all their divisional artillery was captured artillery. So their guns that were on the beaches were mostly captured Czech guns, captured French guns. And yes, the U.S. Army was very familiar with the type of gun that was at Pointe-du-Hoc, because number one, they had used them in World War I. But strangely enough, the U.S. Army coastal artillery on the Atlantic coast and the Pacific coast were still using the same type of gun, the 155 millimeter GPF. The U.S. Army was still using them in World War II. So if you see pictures of U.S. coastal artillery units in World War II defending the Atlantic coast and Pacific coast, that's the type of gun that they're using. And they look very similar. They have the same kind of gun pits, very similar layouts, similar tactics. So the U.S. was very familiar with this weapon, and that's why they knew that it was a serious threat to the transport areas and to bombarding the transport areas during these dangerous hours prior to the amphibious landing.
I want to remind everybody that we're talking to Stephen Zaloga, who's the author of Smashing Hitler's Guns, The Rangers at Pointe-du-Hoc, D-Day 1944. And to answer someone's question. All the guns we're talking about so far, or almost all of them, are guns at Pointe-du-Hoc. We have a question from Wally Morrison here, and he wants to know what kind of chance for success did Rudders, well, he says Rudder, but it's Rudder. Did Rudder's Rangers have? What kind of chance of success did Schaeff give this mission? And because Wally's asked this question, I'll put his other question in there too. Maybe you can answer it first, which is, who came up with the word Rangers to describe these guys? We know that comes from Rogers Rangers back in pre-Revolutionary War, but who applied it to this unit?
The name comes from Lucien Truscott, and Lucien Truscott, well-known U.S. general during World War II. He's known more for his leadership in the Italian theater during the Italian campaign. But Truscott was given the assignment by George C. Marshall to go over to England and act as a liaison officer between the U.S. Army and their commandos. Marshall had been over in London. He had been briefed on the commandos. There were a lot of press reports about the commandos. And so Truscott was sent over to London to learn about it and to help establish an American equivalent of the commandos. And Marshall and, strangely enough, Dwight Eisenhower later told Truscott, we want an equivalent of the commandos, but don't use the name commando. That is, that's a British name. They have used that themselves. That name should stick with the British force. Come up with a new name. And the name Rangers did come up, most likely because of the Rangers from the French and Indian War. And my own suspicion is because right around that time, there was a very popular movie called Northwest Passage, which was a kind of a docudrama about the Rangers during the French and Indian War. And I think that's why that particular name was picked. But then getting to the issue of the chances of success for Rudder's team, Rudder himself expected to take 50% casualties at Pointe-du-Hoc. He expected that the mission would succeed, but that there would be very, very heavy casualties. He expected it to succeed because previous commando missions similar to this had succeeded. There had been a similar operation during Dieppe, the August 1942 landings, where the commandos had gone up 2 sets of cliffs to take out 2 separate German gun batteries. Now, admittedly, they were night missions, but very similar sort of situation. They had been successful. So the people who were close to the mission, meaning the British liaison officers from the commandos, the planning officers from Cossack and from the Schaeff headquarters, who were familiar with the commando operations, they were reasonably confident that the mission was going to succeed. The further away that you got from the planners, the more skeptical they were. So there was somebody who said, a couple of old ladies with broomsticks could push the Rangers off the cliff. So there was a greater level of skepticism further away. But the other thing that I should throw in here, and one point that's oftentimes misunderstood, and you alluded to it a little bit earlier, the Rangers were not the first step in dealing with Pointe-du-Hoc. The first step were the air attacks. The second step were the naval bombardment. The third step was the Rangers. Now, the reason for this is that the Allies had studied all the previous amphibious operations and the threat posed by coastal artillery and on all of these previous operations. And they had learned from all of these operations that even though you could put the batteries, these type of coastal gun batteries, you could put them out of operation by air attack. The air attacks had only temporary effects. What they had found is that, yes, you could knock out a battery for an hour or two, but the Germans, especially if they were very determined, would clear up the debris and get the guns working after a few hours. And they didn't want that to happen. So the Rangers were the insurance to make sure that the batteries stayed out of operation. The Allies were convinced they could take the batteries out of operation by a combination of air attack and naval gunfire. And it was the job of Rudder's Rangers to get there, secure the gun pits, and make sure the Germans couldn't put these guns back in operation. Now, if you look down the road at Longseau-Mer, the other really good coastal battery near Omaha Beach, that's exactly what happened. They did not have a Ranger operation or a paratroop operation, so they bombarded and shelled Longseau-Mer, and they kept Longseau-Mer out of business for a few hours. But then Longseau-Mer, the Germans cleaned up the site and started firing again. And so Longseau-Mer fired on the ships off of Omaha Beach for the better part of the afternoon. And they were finally silenced by a combination of naval gunfire and British troops finally capturing the site.
So, Steve, we've been talking a lot about the Rangers and some of the Allied efforts, but could you tell us a little bit more about the Germans? Because I know before I read your book, the Germans are sort of this sort of faceless people on top of the bluff, and we don't really know that much about them. On my choice, people say, well, how many Germans are up here? And I've always had different accounts, and who are they? And I'd like to flesh that out for us. Who are the Rangers facing up there?
Yeah, they're facing an artillery battery, so they're facing roughly 200 men, but that's 200 men scattered over the whole area, including the moved guns. The actual gun crews went with the guns. Now each crew or each gun has 8 men, and you had 6 guns, so there's going to be roughly 30 men plus munitions handlers. So a chunk of that 200 is over near the guns. Now what it is, this battery has been there since 1942. It's part of a larger artillery regiment that was scattered along the Normandy coast. They had a traditional artillery mission at first, dealing with these targets, but it was somewhat different than your usual artillery regiment in that the targets were naval targets, not your traditional army targets. This wasn't an army battery, whereas, for example, Longsword Myth is a German Navy battery. The troops changed through time. When the battery was first established there in 1942, it was mostly a young unit with young soldiers. So the battery commander was in his mid-20s. The average troop were 18 years old, 20 years old, 22 years old. They were young, newly trained artillerymen. What happened through time, especially in the later part of 1943, is there was such an enormous demand for infantry on the Eastern Front and also for reinforcing the infantry on the Western Front that German units, as they put it, combed out these other types of units, especially artillery units, meaning that they went to these artillery units and they withdrew the young, more physically fit soldiers and transferred them over to infantry units. And what they got in return was older men, in many cases World War I veterans. So in the fall of 1943, the battery that was at Pointe-du-Hoc suddenly has all of the good quality young troops pulled away and replaced by 30-year-olds and 40-year-olds who had probably served in the First World War and artillery units in the First World War. And the French who were in the neighborhood, because there were some French families that ran essentially small restaurants in the area where the German troops would go, they said that they noticed a change in the German troops that suddenly started to show up at Pointe-du-Hoc. Before that, it was younger guys. Now it's these old guys. And they said the older Germans were very despondent. You know, they had been involved in war before. They knew what war was like. And once the Allies started bombing and shelling these batteries, which starts to happen in late April, these guys get really depressed because they understand what's going to happen, that they're just going to be subjected to more and heavier bombardment, especially if there's going to be any landings here. So the French people who are reporting to the resistance keep saying, yeah, there's older troops here, and they're not of the quality of the troops that were here in 42, 43. Now, there was an incident at Pointe-du-Hoc immediately before the landing, which has not been entirely fleshed out. I didn't do the interview, but some researchers interviewed a French family who had some members living in the immediate area on D-Day. And they said that there was an incident at one of the farm buildings that was being used by the Germans as a headquarters, where a young German soldier, I shouldn't say young, but a German soldier walked into the officers' mess and detonated a high explosive device in amongst the officers. This particular German soldier had just learned from the home front that his family had been killed during the Allied bombings, and he was despondent and depressed. And we don't know his real motives because there's nothing left in writing beyond this rather cryptic description by a French family, 2 generations removed from the actual incident. But apparently a large part of the staff of this artillery regiment or this artillery battery was killed days before the D-Day landing, and they received new officers only days before the landing. And that's corroborated by the fact that a Swedish coastal artillery officer visited Pointe-du-Hoc after World War II in order to learn the lessons of coastal artillery in World War II. And he talked to some French civilians there at the time, and they said yes, that the battery had received new officers immediately before the D-Day landing. Now the problem is that this battalion, this battery didn't leave any records. You know, the battery was absolutely shattered. I mean, if you want, we can go into some description about how badly bombed this site was, but there's no paper records of the battery at Pointe-du-Hoc except for higher commands where there's short cryptic descriptions of what's happening there. You know, so at Army Group B level, at the level of the divisions, there are some records saying, you know, the battery was bombed last night and here's what happened at the battery. But there's not the kind of detailed sort of thing. For example, there's no casualty figures. We don't know. We know how many guns were damaged, but we don't know how many troops were injured, how many troops were wounded, that sort of thing. Now, there were a number of Germans who were captured at Pointe-du-Hoc, but we don't know much about them. I've gone through an awful lot of the D-Day prisoner of war accounts that still survive, and I haven't found any from Pointe-du-Hoc. I found some from areas nearby, but none from Pointe-du-Hoc. The reason for that is that most of these prisoners were picked up and they were shipped off to the battleship Texas, and Texas didn't want to bother with them, and so when Texas was rearming, they brought him back over to the coast of England and just dumped him off. So they never fell into the usual process of the Allied intelligence officers and historians going and talking to them. So apparently there were no records kept by USS Texas about these guys. Some of the crew on Texas did talk to them, but there's no known written records from the survivors. Now, the only records that do exist is that over the years, some Germans who did tours on the Omaha Beach area, when they were doing their tours, some veterans from the unit did come back to Omaha Beach. And so there's some very, very small accounts of these soldiers coming back and talking a little bit about what happened. For example, the only reason we know what happened to the German guns, why the German guns didn't fire, is that at least two of the members who were attached to the guns, the actual gunners, they went back to Omaha Beach years afterwards, and they talked to this tour guide who wrote a history in German about it. And he said they got stinking drunk that night and just ran away. And that's the reason that the guns didn't fire. And there's the accounts of at least two Germans who basically said they were just fed up. They had been repeatedly bombed. And that's the point that doesn't come across in most published histories. Pointe-du-Hoc. Pointe-du-Hoc was bombed and then bombed again and then bombed again and bombed again. There was something on the average of 10 tons per acre of bombs that fell on Pointe-du-Hoc. And it happened repeatedly. This wasn't just the night of D-Day. It had happened in April where they were first bombed. And then there were several other bombings repeatedly. And so this place was just bombed and bombed and bombed again. And then, of course, on D-Day, there was the big flash lamp raid where they dumped almost 5 tons of bomb per acre on D-Day. And then it was followed up by USS Texas bombarding it. And then some B-26 Marauders came in and bombed it. Then some P-47 Thunderbolts came in and bombed it. And then the destroyer sat offshore and continued to bomb with 5-inch guns.
Well, you provide like a really interesting statistic in the book that talks about the amount of bombardment along the whole Omaha Beach sector, and what percentage of that bombardment was actually aimed right at Pointe-du-Hoc.
It was like
half. It was more than half.
Yeah,
and that was the sad thing. I would certainly argue that the way that the bombardment of Omaha Beach, because Pointe-du-Hoc is essentially part of Omaha Beach, the bombardment of Omaha Beach, the planning for it was a complete failure. I mean, one of the reasons that the 116th suffered so badly in Vierville Draw is none of the German defenses at Vierville Draw were hit by the preliminary bombardment. They weren't hit by the naval gunfire, and they weren't hit by the air attack. There was as everybody knows, 8th Air Force was supposed to bomb the main sites on Omaha Beach, and they failed to do so. They bombed inland. The bombs hit inland. But beyond that, the rocket bombardment that was supposed to hit there didn't. It landed in the ocean, so none of that hit. The 5-inch guns didn't hit any of the targets because they really didn't understand what the target array was. They didn't understand the German defenses at Vierville Draw or Colville Draw, the two main German defense positions. And so basically the two critical sites on Omaha Beach escaped bombardment. And there just wasn't a lot being fired there. USS Texas was up at Pointe-du-Hoc just absolutely bombarding Pointe-du-Hoc with 14-inch guns and, their secondary batteries and the whole thing. whereas Omaha Beach gets a couple of destroyers, firing 5-inch guns. And yes, they fire a couple hundred rounds, but that's it. And the thing to keep in mind is that Atlantic wall bunkers, the bunkers built up to what's called Standard B, are resistant to naval gunfire up to 8-inch, meaning they cannot be penetrated by guns smaller than 8-inch. Well, the destroyers are firing 5-inch guns, so even if the destroyers did hit these bunkers, it's not going to penetrate the bunkers.
Yeah.
So when we visit Pointe-du-Hoc, and you come in and you come up to Rudder's command post, and then later you come to the observation post up by the point. And people are really interested, of course, in they're drawn to the attack up the cliffs, the firing of the grapnels, the climbing of the cliffs, the kind of the drama, the gripping drama of that moment. But what's interesting is that that is, in fact, a fairly short and low casualty event compared to the fighting that takes place later on that day, that night, and the next day. So can you talk a little bit about that later fighting and why that is so devastating to the Rangers there?
Yeah, I think that people's impression of Pointe-du-Hoc are probably very heavily shaped by the famous movie Longest Day. So there's a depiction within Longest Day of the Ranger attack. And, it's shown with the Rangers climbing up, and it's done very accurately. It was done on Pointe-du-Hoc, so it looks great. It's very authentic in that respect. And it shows the grapnel hooks and the whole thing. But they show an awful lot of Germans out there with grenades and machine guns and everything firing at the Rangers. And in fact, what had actually happened on D-Day is that there were very few German survivors on Pointe-du-Hoc on D-Day. And yes, they did, in fact, fire at the Rangers. They threw grenades. They fired over the cliffs. But Ranger casualties, at least during the climbing phase, were not very heavy. There were certainly some Rangers wounded. I haven't found any evidence there were any Rangers killed during the process of climbing. There were certainly some Rangers killed once they got up to the top. But during the actual climbing process, I haven't seen any evidence there were any killed. There were certainly some wounded. Now, the situation changes very much once they get up on top of Pointe-du-Hoc and start performing their mission. Their mission is, find the gun pits, destroy the guns. Once you've done that, go down to the road and start pushing south. And so they start moving out. They get to the gun pits. They suddenly realize there's no guns here. There were telephone poles substituting as guns. So they follow their orders and they keep moving southward. And in the process, they keep running into small numbers of German troops. Now, the Germans were pretty much stunned by the bombardment, but the heaviest defenses, the rifle defense and the machine gun pit defenses, there was a string of defenses down at the outer edge of the Pointe-du-Hoc position, and that received relatively less bombardment than the gun batteries. The obvious target at Pointe-du-Hoc was the gun batteries, but Pointe-du-Hoc itself is several acres. So the gun pits, the gun batteries were very, very heavily bombarded, but as you got further south, down towards the road, it was more thinly bombarded. So there were farm buildings, that sort of thing. And the German defenses there were still relatively intact. There were German riflemen from 352nd Infantry Division, from other units down in those buildings. And so after having suffered relatively modest casualties coming up and getting up on top of Pointe-du-Hoc, the Rangers start moving south, and it's a typical infantry battle. Infantry battles are bloody affairs. When you have people fighting at very, very close range with machine guns, light mortars, all that sort of things, the casualties start mounting up. And so there's a single incident where the Rangers are pushing down towards the road where they suffer somewhere in the neighborhood of over a dozen casualties within a couple minutes. Well, that's more casualties than they suffered the whole time of getting up the cliffs and, the immediate process of capturing the gun. And that happened continuously over the next few days because the Germans realized what's happened. They realized that, as they put it, some commandos have taken Pointe-du-Hoc. And so the troops in the immediate vicinity of Pointe-du-Hoc, not the artillery battery, but the German infantry units nearby, they're ordered to counterattack. And so there's a succession of German infantry counterattacks against Pointe-du-Hoc over the next 2 days. And that's where the Rangers start really suffering casualties. Then on top of that, the Germans have a lot of artillery in the neighborhood because Allied intelligence had failed to pick up the fact that the 352nd Infantry Division, the German Infantry Division, had their artillery, or had one of their artillery regiments in the neighborhood, and they start shelling the U.S. troops at Pointe-du-Hoc. And 716th had artillery in that area. So the Rangers started coming under attack from mortars, from artillery, from flak batteries that are in the neighborhood, all sorts of stuff. So the casualties really start ramping up. And then, of course, on the night of D-Day, the Germans staged a night counterattack, which is very destructive, caused quite a few casualties in the Rangers' ranks. Then on top of that, the Rangers are no longer in contact with any U.S. forces, so they're running out of food and ammunition. The LCAs they were bringing in, the two LCAs they were bringing in their supplies, one of them got sunk, and the other one had to basically shed all of the supplies in order to land at the beach. So they have no reinforcements as far as food or ammo or water or anything. So they're there. They're having a very tough fight up on top of Pointe-du-Hoc, and they're running out of ammo. So they start taking German guns, German machine guns. They're starting to use German ammunition and German weapons in order to defend themselves.
So, Steve, one of the things that folks who have traveled with me to Normandy or people who have watched the show a lot, that one of the things that I like to talk about is the idea that D-Day Operation Overlord is an allied operation. And you have people from a bunch of different nations involved in it. And obviously, the Americans take the leading role in Pointe-du-Hoc. But there are other people there. And I was wondering if you could just briefly flesh out kind of the role played by the British Commonwealth forces, because they are there.
Well, the British play a very important role on two of the aspects that are usually overlooked, namely the air role and the naval role. So just starting with the air role, it's RAF units which conduct Operation Flash Lamp, which is the bombardment, the heavy bomber attack on Pointe-du-Hoc in the pre-dawn hours, roughly 3 a.m. on D-Day. And those are Lancaster and Halifax bombers from RAF Bomber Command. And the first casualties at Pointe-du-Hoc on the Allied side are British and related casualties, because RAF has not only British crews, they also have Australian crews, and they have, quite interestingly, Norwegian crews. So there's a Norwegian bomber crew that's lost over Pointe-du-Hoc. The deputy commander for the Flash Lamp raid, a senior RAF commander, he's killed. He's one of the first RAF casualties on D-Day. He's shot down by a German fighter plane over Pointe-du-Hoc. There's an Australian on board one of the aircraft. He's shot down. So there's this Commonwealth RAF plus Norwegian elements to this RAF force. So the RAF is involved right at the outset of the D-Day operation on the RAF side, the Flash Lamp bombardment. And then the other major British role is, of course, the Royal Navy. The flotilla that's responsible for landing the Rangers is British. It's a Royal Navy operation. The landing ships that bring the LCAs into the area are all Royal Navy. And the landing craft, the LCAs that are going to carry the Rangers ashore, those are all Royal Navy, and they're all Royal Navy crews. Also, interestingly enough, the Rangers were intending to use a couple of ducks, the amphibious trucks, that had been rebuilt by the British with ladders, the type of ladders from fire engines. The idea being that these ducks would go up to the edge of the Pointe-du-Hoc cliffs, and they put these ladders up, and then the Rangers could just run up the ladders. Unfortunately, that didn't work out for two reasons. One of the ladder ducks was hit by German fire on the way in, and then one of them kind of got stuck in one of the bomb craters at the base of the cliffs. But those were partly manned by British troops, and interestingly enough, at least two of the drivers from those ducks volunteered to assist the Rangers. So they went up the cliffs and they fought with the Rangers. They took machine guns off those ducks. And so there are British machine guns that you'll see pictures of during the Ranger fighting, Vickers K guns that were used in the defense of Pointe-du-Hoc. And two of those British soldiers were decorated. Then on top of that, the commandos had liaison officers. They had two liaison officers with the Rangers, the people who had been training the Rangers right from the get-go. So you had two experienced commando officers who also took part in the Ranger operation. In fact, the senior commando officer was injured early on in the operation, and you'll see pictures of him kind of wandering around with a bandage around his head because he got whacked in the head. His helmet saved him, but he got whacked in the head by German fire.
So we have only a couple of minutes left, Steve, and there was something I did want to ask you about in the afterword of your book. And there's so much that we haven't even had a chance to talk about. But you have an afterword where you look at sort of the portrayal of the Rangers in the cinema, particularly focusing on The Longest Day, which you just talked about a little bit briefly, and the movie Saving Private Ryan, and in particular the first 30 minutes of Saving Private Ryan, which depicts the D-Day landings, and the Tom Hanks character he's a fictitious person, but he is a second ranger captain. So I wonder if you can, in a minute or two, give us a sense of what you feel that open in Saving Private Ryan got right, and what you feel it got terribly wrong.
Well, it doesn't depict any specific Ranger unit to begin with. Some people have said that the Hanks character is supposed to represent Goranson, the young officer who led Force B. But they don't show it that way because they're landing right in the midst of the attack on Vierville Draw. The depiction is more the Vierville Draw attack, and that's not where Goranson landed. So it's maybe a little bit closer to some of the elements of Force C. So it's not really intended to be a detailed depiction of any particular Ranger operation. It's more like, the experience of landing at Vierville Draw, and it's probably also closer to the experience that the 116th Infantry, the Company A 116th Infantry, and the follow-on waves experienced. So I think it's a very good depiction of what happened at Vierville Draw, the extremely heavy casualties that were endured by the units landing there, and all that sort of thing. And what I tried to do in the afterword of my book was not to quibble about, this figure is accurate and that one's not accurate. I mean, it's a very visceral depiction, and it's great in that sense. I think that it really hits home how nasty that landing was. And so, very successful cinema. I saw it with my dad, when it first came out. I thought it was great. But what I also try to do in the book, and I'm not going to do it here because it's a lot of it's not really nitpicking, but it's like, okay, from an historical standpoint, what's really, really good and what's a little bit off. I don't think anything is really, really off. It's more details. Like, the German fortifications don't look like that. The troops are very much more compressed than they actually would have been on D-Day. It's things like that. It's nitpicking. But I think the overall depiction is very strong, very impressive.
Well, Steve Zaloga, thank you so much for joining us today on History Happy Hour to talk about your book, Smashing Hitler's Guns, The Rangers at Pointe-du-Hoc D-Day 1944. Lots of interesting stuff in there. If you want a book about Pointe-du-Hoc, this is the book to get.
This is the book, yes.
And we hope we had a discussion before we went on the air, and Steve says that he counted up earlier this year, and he's written 262 books. So that could be a whole lifetime of History Happy Hour visits in the future. But we do hope, maybe we won't talk about all of them, but we do hope to have you back at some point to talk about a few of them. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Steve.
And next week, we'll have one last encore episode for 2023.
I just want to say, though, you guys should see this stack of unread books that Rick and I have. So we're going to be diving in.
We are busy reading them.
Yes.
Right now.
Right after the new year, we'll be all set with all kinds of live shows.
We'll have the whole year read. Wouldn't
right.
that be amazing? That would not happen, but anyway. Anyway, we'll be talking next week with Stephen Kershaw in another encore episode about his book, 3 Epic Battles That Saved Democracy, Marathon, Thermopylae, and Salamis. And what better way to celebrate New Year than with some ancient Greek history?
Nothing says Hogmanay like ancient Greek history.
I know, right? Then in January and February, we'll have John Hancock. We'll have World War II Arctic convoys, General William Simpson, commander of the Ninth Army, and more. It should be a great year as we begin our fifth season.
Isn't Joe joining us in January?
Joe Balkowski is joining us in February. I have sent his hat to him.
Well, he hasn't shown up for the 5th show though, so that's good.
Well, we had to send his hat so he can wear it.
Oh, I see. Okay.
When we do the show, I mean, I suppose he could just say,
right in Josephine.
He could just blow us off right now.
Always achieved everything, right?
My nefarious plot worked. I have the hat. I don't need to do the 5th show.
Absolutely.
And his address is back in Baltimore, so I guess his time in Boston is over.
Wow, he couldn't take it. Couldn't take it.
We'll find out when we talk to him.
About that. Yeah.
Guys, please subscribe to us on YouTube, follow us on Facebook, shout at us on Twitter, listen to our podcast. I cannot say podcast. Back us on Patreon, and browse historyhappyhour.com.
Thanks, everybody. Happy holidays and be safe.